Good afternoon, everyone. This is Nancy Weinstein. I'm the founder of Mindprint Learning. I am thrilled to have you join us today for the fifth in our Science of Learning webinar series. Thrilled to have you here today. We're going to focus on test anxiety. We'll spend about an hour. There is opportunity, if you're viewing this live, to put in questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer them during the session if there's time. If not, we will definitely reach out to you after. I'm going to try and continue here. So for those of you who have not yet seen this, this is the list of other webinars in the series that we'll be doing throughout the year. We're doing them monthly. We welcome your participation. All of the webinars will also be available on YouTube, and if you register and can't make it, you'll be sent a link to be able to watch the video after. So we do encourage you to register even if you can't be there. And this is where you can find us on YouTube. Just type in Mindprint Learning into the search box on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and you'll also get an update every time we add a new video online. So, and you can see the earlier ones in the series are already posted up there. So the goals for today, we're going to actually define anxiety. We look at it in two different ways. And so we're going to start there, and then we're going to talk about how we manage anxiety and understanding it at the root cause of it, and then talk very specifically about strategies for, I shouldn't say improvement, but probably addressing your students' anxiety. So when we talk about anxiety, we think more about, we sort of break it out into two general areas. There's generalized anxiety. So there are students that have an anxiety diagnosis, and that is not just going to apply in test prep situations. It could apply in social situations. Sometimes doctors will say whatever their thing is. So you might have anxiety. We don't understand at different times because it's personal to you. Very different than what I'll call test anxiety in this case, which is a student, we all have a little bit of anxiety, but a student that doesn't have an anxiety diagnosis, but is really anxious for tests and seems to be interfering, that anxiety is interfering with their performance. So we're going to think about those two things differently. And today we're going to focus on the test anxiety piece because that's what we can answer or start to support as educators. Different from generalized anxiety. If you do have a student that you think is really struggling with anxiety, it is interfering with different aspects of their life, we do suggest you go and get them clinical support and the supports and information that they need to help them through that generalized anxiety. One of our favorite books is by an author by the name of Tamar Chansky. It's called Freeing Your Child from Anxiety. You can get it online on Amazon. That's one book as a parent or as a teacher to get started in supporting students with all different types of anxiety. Somewhat disturbing information is that students in high achieving schools are now named as an at-risk group. And so we know that mental health is a pervasive problem and concern in schools across America, particularly in top performing schools. So anxiety is real. If kids are struggling, we really want you to get them the support they need for their anxiety that might be interfering with sleep, social situations, eating properly, but that is not where we're going to focus our time today. That said, if you want to get started, these are just two, we've created strategy cards. If you're a Mindprint customer, you want to reach out to either Vicki or Neil, they can help you get started and find these cards. For everyone else, you can find them online in the Mindprint toolbox. But the two top strategies, if you do have a student that's struggling with generalized anxiety, one is to validate their feelings, right? So don't dismiss the anxiety. It's what they're feeling, and if they're feeling it, it's real to them, and you want to support them. And then the other thing about anxiety that we've know is a pretty useful strategy is to give students distraction breaks. So not to let them take breaks and sort of wander around, because that can lead to racing thoughts, but to just give them breaks where they're doing something like Sudoku or crossword puzzle, something that they enjoy, that can give them a break from whatever stress that they're feeling. And so, two quick, relatively easy to implement strategies in the grand scheme of things, and can help you get started in supporting a student while you might be getting them the other support that they need. But today we're going to focus most of our time on test anxiety, and we adapted this curve. It's from the Yerkes-Dodson law for those who like the research. But the idea that there a little bit of anxiety when taking a test is actually a good thing, right? So if a student feels no stress about taking a test, that might not be good. It might mean that they're not particularly motivated and they don't care, right? So that's not to say always the case, but a little bit of anxiety can sort of get the heart racing, get a little bit of adrenaline going, and propel a student to have the energy that they need to get through a time test, a stressful situation, right? That said, there is a point where you have too much stress, and I think we've seen it, and that's why we're getting such good participation and interest in this call, is that, where is the tipping point? How much anxiety is too much anxiety? And when it starts to make a student feel fatigued, that they can't get through the test in time because anxiety is interfering with their ability to think, that's too much anxiety, right? And then really when you get to that red area, we hope we don't have a whole lot of students getting there, but like students that have panic attacks, they're angry, they just give up and stop trying, and maybe even for some younger students having a meltdown, right? So we want to try and keep our students in that yellow area, and the goal of the strategies we're going to give you today is to not completely eliminate stress, and have students in that green area, but to keep them in that optimal stress level. So those of you who have been on our earlier webinars have seen this equation in the past, but really the big takeaway here is that we have everybody has limited mental energy to problem solve, wherever they are. And in a test, time situation, whether it's 1 hour in-class test or a 3 to 4 hour high stakes test, you only have so much energy, and you got to get through it, and you got to get quickly, right? And our goal overall is to make sure that we give students the capacity to do what they need to problem solve in this tough situations. The thing about anxiety is that it starts to look a lot like working memory when students have too much anxiety, when they're starting to get in that orange and red area, and we've decreased their capacity and their working memory capacity, and that's going to interfere with their ability to problem solve, finish the test on time to the best of their ability. And that's why anxiety is a problem, right? And so if you see things in students taking tests that look like working memory, and we'll talk more about what working memory is later in the session, but if you start to see things that look a lot like working memory, the student takes Mindprint, there's no working memory challenge, it suggests that anxiety is sort of taking over for that student, and that's where we really need to provide them strategies, intervene, and support them to make sure that they can show you their best work. So we've created what we call the test anxiety cycle to sort of show why some students might have more or less test anxiety than others. We know we talked about it a little bit earlier about this pressure to excel in in high achieving schools. That is real. The pressure can come from multiple places. So we will often hear parents saying, well, we don't put any stress on our kids and they're struggling with test anxiety. Well, the pressure to excel obviously can come from the parents, where they want a student to do well on every test in every situation. But it can also be within. Some students are really wired. They want to do well on every test. That's how they feel. And whether or not their parents made them feel that way, or whether or not they're just innately wired that way, they want to excel, and that pressure is just as real as some external pressures we can get from either parents or the environment that we're in, right? So as a parent, you might try and reduce the stress and not focus on grades. But if your student's in a school with high performing students or just has a group of friends that is very high performing, they might feel this excessive pressure to succeed, right? So now that alone, student wants to succeed. That's not a bad thing to want to succeed. However, when students have this sort of meaningful differences in skills where there's a disconnect between what their expectations for success should look like and their mind print skills or their underlying skills and their ability to perform, um, that can cause problems, right? And then when there's that differential in skills, it can cause anxiety. Then anxiety, as we saw earlier, starts to use up our mental energy and our capacity to do work, which can then affect performance. And then when the student doesn't succeed, we end up with this sort of vicious cycle where they aren't achieving on a test the way they wanted to achieve. Um, then they feel more stress, and the cycle goes round and round. It becomes harder to achieve when you get into that sort of orange or red zone in terms of anxiety. So what we want to do is, and what we want to control, what we can control, right? So as the adults in the room, we can try and reduce the pressure to excel, but we realize we can't eliminate all of it. Um, we know that all students have differences in their mind print skills, but this is something we can help students become more aware of and address those differences so that they feel less anxiety. And so that's where we're going to focus a lot of our time today, is how do we address these differences in skills, become aware of them, and use strategies to support them so that we don't feel anxious, so that we're not underperforming and we're not getting in this vicious cycle. So for those of you who haven't had formal training in Mindprint before, when we talk about Mindprint skills, these are the skills that we always think about when we think about how to best support our students and our learners. So in the complex reasoning domain, we talk about 3 areas of reasoning: abstract, ability to work with shapes and numbers; verbal reasoning, ability to work comfortably with words. Verbal reasoning, you've all probably, anybody who's been with me before has heard me say it, verbal reasoning is the highest correlation for overall academic performance on those high stakes standardized tests, verbal reasoning. And then spatial perception, ability to sort of work and manipulate objects in space, very high relationship to performance in math on standardized tests. Executive functions, lots of discussions around executive functions in school these days, but your attention, your working memory, I mentioned it earlier, but your ability to sort of think of working memory as your mind's mental scratch pad, your ability to juggle multiple tasks at once, which is what we're asking students to do on a test, right? We're asking them to be neat. We're asking them to work quickly. And then on any given problem, we might be asking them to follow through on multiple steps. That's all load on working memory. When there's anxiety, it interferes, and that's when things can become a problem. And so that's, a big one is working memory when we think about standardized tests. Flexible thinking, your ability to adapt. So the students where I didn't get the right seat and that ruins my day, right? When I walked into the room, they put me in a seat next to somebody that was blowing their nose throughout the test and I couldn't do anything. That's often flexible thinking, and that's sort of, we want to help students manage those situations and adapt. It also will affect some students on the most challenging questions, right? So how do I move through those? Memory, long-term content knowledge, and then efficiency, your ability to work quickly and accurately throughout the test. So those are the skills we're going to think about as we think about why students are feeling some amount of test anxiety and how we can help them manage that anxiety. So what types of, excuse me for a second. So what types of differences in skills are most likely to affect students as they're feeling some amount of anxiety? So the most common that that we tend to think about when we think about what problem students are having, we tend to think about them not having the content knowledge that they need to succeed on the test, right? So can they think through the problem and solve the problem? And do they remember what they need to remember to do well in the test? And that we will address that, and that's pretty common. Those are kind of learning skills, so they're not just on the test, but it's sort of, do they have the content knowledge, right? So we want to address those today, but we also want to address what we call test taking skills, which are the student has all the content knowledge, they have good reasoning skills, they know how to think through problems, they have the information that they need in their head, and yet they are still not succeeding. They still feel and view themselves as not a good test taker. And those are what we're going to call, for today's purpose, our test taking skills and how we support students in those skills. And those are going to be driven more by Mindprint skills like executive function, their working speed and efficiency, and their stamina. And so those are the students that sort of, we know they went in, they knew everything that they needed to know. We know that they have the capability and they just can't finish, or they make careless mistakes, or start to feel and get in this vicious cycle of, I just don't do my best on standardized tests. And we think that by listening in and following some of our guidance today, you're going to be able to help students on those particular topics. So before I move ahead, I just want to stop here and see if there are any questions in the chat, Vicki, that we want to answer that might be relevant before we move forward.
Hi, everyone. So we had a couple questions. One was about the impact of anxiety, depression on cognitive skills. And so that's something that Nancy's going to be talking about throughout the session today. There's another one that is, are stress and anxiety physiologically interchangeable?
Those are really good and interesting questions. And what I'm going to say is, I'm going to generalize and just say, for the purposes of how it's going to affect students in a test-taking environment, you can pretty much view them the same and is using the same strategies. So the students feeling stressed or anxious, and they could have generalized anxiety or just sort of test anxiety, it's going to affect them the same way. It's going to start, the most typical way where you will see it first will be working memory, because that's the part of the brain that starts to get overloaded first. That said, if a student's really struggling with severe anxiety, you'll start to see it could affect all areas of cognition. So good questions, we'll keep going, and then if more come up, Vicki, feel free to jump in if you think they're relevant to where we are in the presentation. But we're going to give a bunch of strategies to help break this test anxiety cycle. But I want to start by saying how you should be thinking about these strategies and using them before we jump specifically into the strategies. And so the first thing is this level of self-awareness, which we want to develop in our students, but we might have to start as the adults in the room by identifying it first and then giving and providing that self-awareness to students. But understanding what the specific challenge is. So what differences in Mindprint skills or challenges is the student facing that is causing this disconnect between their ability to perform where they want to be and what and how they're actually performing. So what's the challenge? Then knowing which strategies work best for me. So we're going to show you a whole lot of different strategies today, and there are a lot more strategies in the Mindprint toolbox. It is all about finding which strategy is going to work best for that student based on what their profile looks like, their past performance and history, and what feels comfortable and is a good fit. And then as you're thinking about using strategies, the strategies are not going to be a panacea, right? You are not going to see all of a sudden a student that struggled with test anxiety severely, and then, they use a strategy and all the test anxiety goes away. Um, that, it's just not realistic. What you're looking for is to see continuous improvement. Is the strategy working? Was there a little bit less stress? Did the grade go up? Did the score go up? And if so, let's keep using that strategy, seeing if we can use it even better, or do we need to layer on more strategies? The second thing to think about when you think about the strategies is to make sure they're automatic, right? So if a student's going into high stakes testing environment or stressful situation, the last thing we want them to do is think about, okay, now how do I apply this strategy in this situation? We want to get them to the point where they aren't thinking, like, they know, I feel stressed, what do I need to do? And we want to make those strategies like, if I'm stressed and I don't know the answer, I am going to do A, B, and C. I'm not going to think about what I'm going to do. I know that this is what I need to do. And if I know what I need to do, then I'm not going to panic. So my anxiety is not going to get worse. And even better, hopefully I'm going to feel confident that I can get to the right answer because I have a strategy and I know the strategies worked for me in the past. And then we get on the opposite of that sort of bad cycle, we get a virtuous cycle of continuous improvement. The other thing, the other important information for adults to realize and recognize is that for students with anxiety, tough love is often not the answer. Again, every student is different. You need to figure out how to best to motivate and drive a student. For kids who might not be motivated or have other reasons for not performing, we might want to give them some tough love sometimes. But for kiddos who are truly struggling with anxiety, and that's the root cause of it, giving them positive, sincere feedback. Like, we don't want to give feedback unless it's positive feedback unless it's sincere, but that type of positive ongoing feedback is usually going to be more beneficial for the student and for the outcomes than giving quote unquote tough love. And then the other thing is that just like anything else, when something's hard, the more we practice, the better we get. So as teachers, if we can give them more formative assessment, as tutors, if we can give them more practice tests, it's going to sort of reduce that pit in the stomach that we feel as soon as we get the test and we look at the paper and see those bubble sheets. The more practice we get, the more comfortable we just get with that pit. Like, I know I'm going to feel that pit in my stomach. And so it's not new to me, and I just got to power through it, is helpful. And then also, the more practice you get with taking a test, you get familiarity with the format, and then we're actually reducing some of that thinking around, this looks unfamiliar, what do I do? Or I don't remember what to do. So all good things to think about as you think about how to use strategies and implement them with your students. So now we're going to go into what we continuously hear is the favorite part of our presentations, which are worked examples. What do I do for this particular student at this particular point in time? So here's our first student. For those who are unfamiliar with the Mindprint profile, I'm going to just review again what you're seeing on the screen. So on the left-hand side, you see the green shape that says spatial perception with a star. This is a student who has excellent spatial perception, ability to manipulate objects in space, and very good reasoning skills. They're abstract, verbal, flexible thinking, all really good. This is a student who would be comfortable in any environment, right? The blue, here in the medium part of the range, we see this is sort of the chunky middle, if you will. Most students have most skills in this bucket, right? These are students, if you see a student having a Mindprint skill in this bucket, really capable of doing anything we're giving them, K to 12, might not be their go-to, they might not be the best in the class, but they should be, with the right strategies and support, really good at performing. Down here, as we get a little bit lower, these are things that could interfere with performance, not necessarily, depending on the situation, context, amount of effort, and what the skill is. And then finally here in the purple bucket, these are skills where students really might need scaffolds and support. We want to make sure that they have the strategies of how to deal, in this case, the student with weaker verbal memory, how to think about remembering words more easily, vocabulary words, what they read in the text after the fact, so that it doesn't interfere with their ability for, comprehension, right? So how to not, give strategies to support that. So in this case, as I mentioned, this is a student with really strong reasoning skills, so great spatial perception. That's really going to help in math, science areas, but verbal reasoning well above average. Students should be, really good understanding most concepts. But as I just mentioned, verbal memory not nearly as strong, might even struggle. So they might understand everything that they're taught in class, but they might struggle to remember it when it comes time for the test if they didn't study appropriately, or I shouldn't say appropriately, but not enough, or the extra effort that they need to make sure that they know what they need to do. So how do we support this student, right? The strategies we're going to give the student are those strategies that we would use in any classroom environment, same as you would use it for test prep, but their reasoning skills are stronger than their memory skills. So we want them to practice, the content more. They need to space out their studying and do more repetition of what they need to have core foundational knowledge. And what you might find are the students that look like this are students that have gaps in knowledge. Like, they're really bright, they understand everything, and then, you give them, or you ask them something from a couple weeks ago and they don't remember it, and you might be surprised that they don't remember it. Well, it's not that their memory skills are weaker. So we want to teach them how to space out their studying. And again, these strategy cards, the strategies are all available online for free on Mindprint. For those who are Mindprint customers, you can now email us and you can get the printable versions of them. The other strategy for students with stronger reasoning and weaker memory is to do retrieval practice. So to make sure that as they're studying, they're pulling information out of memory so that they know it. So they're not just reading. And so this will help them know if they know the information. So students with strong reasoning, weaker memory tend to think they know it and have memorized everything they need to know, when really they've understood it, but it's not in that sort of mental storage cabinet in the back of their brain where they can pull it out when they need it. And so you want to give them, retrieval practice is one of the most effective ways, right? So you want to make sure students know, in this case, rather than giving them multiple choice where they recognize the right answer, if you're a classroom teacher, you might ask them to write out the answer, so to make sure that they can pull it out of long-term memory. The next profile I want to look at is a student who has stronger verbal skills and weaker visual skills, right? So we see, strong verbal reasoning. This is the most highly correlated, again, to academic performance and performance on standardized tests. And then really you can see nothing in the lower end of the range. Like, this is a student who can do well pretty much on any test with work, and especially through middle school, right? What you might see with the student when they get to high stakes tests is they just don't do as well on the math and science section, right? So their abstract reasoning and spatial skills are just not quite as strong as their verbal skills. They work hard, they have a good teacher, they still do well and get straight A's in math. But then they get to standardized tests, and like the questions are a little bit trickier in ways that they haven't seen them before. And, they start to not do as well. So what do we do for the student? We teach them the right strategies the same way we would in the classroom, so that they can think through math problems the right way. So the two most helpful strategies for the student might be what's called elaboration. In the research literature, we would call it describe it. So for students whose verbal skills are stronger than their visual skills, we want to give them time to, that we want to ask them to sort of think through the problem in words, not just rely on the pictures, to make sure they understand it. If they're if they're taking a standardized test, they might actually describe the question to themselves and talk through the question out loud. Using words to describe the picture will help them be more effective. And as if you're a tutor working with a student that's struggling on the math section with stronger verbal skills, and you ask them if they understand something, they say they understand it, you might ask them to describe it for you, to explain it to you. How would you explain it to a friend? And using that verbal remediation and elaboration is going to help them. The other thing is to use concrete examples, right? So getting away from the abstract and sort of saying, okay, what does this look like? How would I use this in the real world? Where would I see an example of a sine curve? You know, how does it look like a wave? Those kinds of things are going to be really important, to not just assume that this student with good reasoning skills who understands a lot is really understanding those abstract concepts. We want to make sure that we're making it a little bit more tangible for them. So I do want to just pause again and just ask Vicki, as she's monitoring the chat, if there are any additional questions that we might want to answer for students who, you know, really focusing on students who have the capability. We know that they understand a lot, but might not have the content knowledge, and we're surprised when we get them for test prep about not having the knowledge that they need to do the work.
So right now we don't have additional questions, but everyone just feel free to type questions in as Nancy goes along.
Great. Thanks, Vicki. So, okay, now is the sort of second part, which I think is the one that gets people, you know, pretty excited to figure out how they can address some of these, what we'll call test-taking skills. We view them differently from content knowledge. So it's not about gaps in knowledge. It's about, I understand this content, it's all in my memory, and how do I get it out on paper so that I can prove how much I know, right? And not let my anxiety get in the way of it, and be successful in showing my best work. So those of you who have been online on Mindprint may hopefully have seen this report already, but we offer this test-taking skills report where we take the Mindprint skills and we translate it to where the student most likely will, you know, sort of view that area as a strength versus where it might very well likely interfere with their ability to show their best work, right? So in this case, we have a student who we can see at the top has good focus, probably pretty good attention accuracy. But we can see in the bottom left that coachability is a problem. And by coachability, we mean if we give them a strategy and we encourage them to use it and they say they're going to use it, do they actually use the strategy? Do they adapt for the question that they've never seen before, that's sort of the trick question, or do they panic and shut down, right? And so you can have students who have exceptional reasoning skills, weaker flexible thinking, and they're going to show up with an orange here, right? So we as the adults need to support them and realize that just giving them a strategy might not be enough, but we need to work with them, make sure that they're applying the strategy, willing to take feedback, willing to listen and adapt. Unfortunately, that because it is coachability, it can be coached, but we need to know which students need that coaching. And then you can see that the student has a bunch of test-taking skills. Green, probably don't need to worry about those things, but we do see a bunch of things in that yellow monitor range, which means probably had some skills in the low expected blue, you know, all the way to the right on that Mindprint profile in that blue area. Maybe one's in the middle and on a relative basis. This might be a challenge for the student and interfere with them showing their best work. So we'll go back to the profiles and talk about, okay, what would a profile look like for a student who is struggling with focus, is struggling with stamina? And by stamina, we mean a student who might be really focused and attentive for the first 30 questions and then sort of start to trail off and show a lot more mistakes towards the end, and not because the questions get harder, but because they just lose energy. Or they do, if they're taking the ACT, they do, they got all their energy and they're great on the English and the math, and by the time they get to the science section, they are completely depleted and vomit on a consistent basis, and only because they just don't have the stamina. And then by inconsistent, we mean those scattered errors, right? Not content knowledge, but I knew the answer to that question and I just got it wrong, right? And when I go back and I review it, I'm like, oh, I knew the answer to that, right? This is what a profile of that student might look like. And of course, we took like an extreme case where we have a student with, we can see here, exceptional reasoning skills. That's what those stars mean next to the abstract and spatial perception, great verbal reasoning, flexible thinking, ability to adapt. And yet you can see here on the lower end of the expected range, so not in the purple, right? It doesn't have to be in the purple, but for this student on a relative basis, lower attention, works a little bit more slowly. And you know, what's gonna happen with this student, right? So we know that this student goes in and knows everything that they need to know for the test. They should be nailing it, right? And what we find is that despite how much they know, they have difficulty finishing, they have scattered errors. It might be the student that, you know, if they're taking the SAT, gets 1,400 on one practice test and then gets a, you know, 1,200 on the next practice test. You know, why is that happening? Well, because that's what attention is. That attention is about inconsistency. You can have different days, you know, didn't eat breakfast, had a bad day, just harder to sustain that focus to do all the challenges of maintaining one's mental energy for a standardized test. What do we do for that student, right? We, in 12 weeks of test prep that you might have a student for, so that's sort of the average we hear from our tutors, is that they're working with the student for 12 weeks. You're not going to really mold their attention. Attention's malleable, it's not that malleable, right? You can't change their attention. What you can do are give them strategies to support their attention so that it's less likely to interfere with their performance. And so the strategy, you know, I mean, obvious, but a strategy for sustaining focus. So this would be the starting point for your student. How can you help them sustain focus? So the idea here is, you know, we make the test prep cards a little bit different because we're hoping that you will print them out for your student and your student can sort of put them in their drawer and know which cards that they need to use when they practice and to remind themselves. So this first box in the upper left is really sort of preparation and what you would do with the student as you're preparing them for test prep. And then what you see in the bottom right is what we want the student to do, right? Like our checklist that you'll see in other places. But we want the student to, you know, what are you going to do before you lose focus, right? You know that you have weaker attention, right? We've seen it. We've seen that drop off. What can you do before you lose focus so that you don't lose focus, right? So if we know that we're losing focus at question number 40, we start to fall apart. Okay, what can we do at question 30 or 35 so we don't lose focus, right? And so it can be something as simple as making sure you stretch or take a deep breath or take a sip of water, right? But you want to learn to catch that focus before we start to see the inconsistency. A lot of tutors like to use the sort of keep moving strategy for students with weaker attention, which is if your hand's not moving, then you might be trailing off and staring out the window and not even realizing it. So if you are, is my hand moving? Keeping my pencil and using my pencil and my eraser as much as I can to make sure that I'm not trailing off. So if I'm reading, I'm using the reading passages. Now, using a pencil is not, in some cases, not the most efficient way to get through those reading passages if you have good attention. But if using your pencil to track your place while you're reading is going to prevent you from losing focus, that is worth slowing down a little bit to make sure that you don't lose focus. So you want to keep on with the small physical movements to make sure that you're staying alert. And then for these same students, the most important thing might be when you finish, and assuming you finish the test, what are you going to do to check your work? And having a very clear strategy by whatever type of test you're working on. So ACT, SAT, it would be by subject test. If you're taking a physics test, what are you going to do to check your physics test? But how am I going to check my work? Because I know because of my weaker focus, I am more prone to making errors. How am I going to go back and check my work? And that's for you to work with the student to come up with that strategy. What am I going to do given the amount of time I have remaining in the test, and what's going to work best for me? Okay, so I'm going to assume Vicki, chime in if you see any questions in the chat box. Otherwise, I'm going to go on to our next student profile.
Yeah, you can move ahead, Nancy.
Great. Okay, so I hope everybody's still with us. I can see from the participant list that we still got a good crowd here. So so stay with us because it really, I mean, any tutor who's working with a variety of students is working with students that have these types of profiles, and it really can be game changing for student performance. So again, I took another extreme case, but a student so that we could really focus on where the relative weakness is to support the student. So in this case, another student with exceptional reasoning skills, really good visual memory. So we know that the problem is not content knowledge with the student, right? Like they know it, they understand it, they could probably problem solve, and we will see this student sometimes really struggling to live up to that full potential. And in this case, it's working memory. So working memory is part of the executive functions domain. It could look a lot like inattention. In some cases, you know, it is, and you see them both together. But I chose this profile specifically because it allows us to break it out and understand that a student could have fine attention, and, you know, works at a fine pace, but it's working memory, and we need to use a slightly different approach. The student with weaker working memory is likely to have those sort of silly mistakes. So they might finish everything on time and get through everything. You know, their stamina's fine, but they forgot the negative sign, right? Even though they had it all the way through the problem. Or they just, you know, they knew to do the last step, they just forgot to do it. They just didn't finish the problem all the way. Or you ask them after and say, did you check your work? And they forgot to check their work. Like anything around I forgot can often be, and you know that the student has weaker working memory, it's often a working memory challenge. And so we want to make sure that they have the strategies to deal with that. Now going in, if we know that, we want to make sure that those students have supports. And I want to again emphasize that if you have a student who is struggling with anxiety, even if they did fine on working memory on Mindprint, anxiety can make the brain look a lot like working memory. So this is a sort of profile that you want to assume that anyone with anxiety, with a lot of test anxiety or generalized anxiety during a test, is going to need strategies to support working memory, right? And so the strategies that we again would use would be for the write down everything you can, right? That mental scratch pad is consumed, the anxiety sort of taking it over. So we want to put as little there as we need to. So try and not do the mental math unless it's really going to make you that much more efficient. Kind of don't trust your mental scratch pad, if you will. Write it down on paper. Make sure you you're showing your work, and you can go back and it's easy to check your work if you have time at the end, as you're more likely to be prone to those quote unquote silly mistakes. As students are working through a test, you want them to really have like a nice set of symbols that they can rely on to eliminate their incorrect answers, things that they know are absolutely incorrect. Put a question mark knowing the ones, well, it could be, and, or circle the ones that they know are right. And so that way, because they might forget, like in their, they knew that C was the right answer, but then when they went to grid in, they put in B because their working memory wasn't working between the time where they figured out the answer and they went to grid it in on the bubble sheet. So you want to make it really, you want to give them strategies so it can be really easy for them um, to check their work, to go back to see what they meant to do, because what they meant to do and intended to do and even thought that they did might not be what they actually did. And so that's how you have to think about working memory. It's sort of, I knew what to do, but I didn't do it. And so give them every way to go back and make it easier to go back, check, find mistakes, and not have those quote unquote silly mistakes. And then the last part we have down here is around managing anxiety. Obviously, easier said than done. If it was easy to manage anxiety, we wouldn't have so many folks on this webinar today. But again, we're not trying to eliminate all anxiety, but we need to make sure that we get those anxiety levels low enough through, practice and comfort with the test and everything else, so that they can really start to show their best work. Okay. Next profile is visual-spatial efficiency. So I'm going to guess that most of us have not seen this in other places around test prep, but it's a really important one for some students. So in this case, you can see that so you can see that this is a student with solid reasoning skills, good memory. So if we give them something to memorize, give them vocabulary, can get it in there and should be able to retrieve it really quickly and efficiently. So can get a really good solid score on a standardized test and certainly do well on classroom tests. But that bubble sheet format can be really tough for students with slower visual motor speed and or weaker spatial perception, right? So the idea of going from test booklet to that bubble sheet can be a killer for students with weaker spatial skills. Just sort of their mind starts to jumble up when they see all those lines or those little bubbles. If they're online, they might forget to scroll. They might lose track of their place when they're doing things, going up and down the screen, going from screen to paper. And so it can be tough for that student. And we want to make sure that we give them what I'll call mechanical strategies to support their performance so that they can work efficiently and get what they know down on paper. And so for those of you who didn't know, you can actually go online and print out those bubble sheets and have students practice gridding them in. Now, if a student doesn't have weaker visual motor skills or spatial skills, I would not spend a whole lot of time practicing gridding in a bubble sheet. But for students with weaker skills, that really might make a difference for them. So so keep that in mind. So the way we sort of spell out our bubble sheet mechanics on our what to do slide, sort of simple things is sort of minimize what's going on the desktop and minimize what the student has to look at once. So folding over the test booklet can be really key for some students. And it just sort of minimizes the load, what they're looking at visually. Making sure that they circle their final answer. They're just going to be more prone to grid in mistakes. So I knew the right answer, and I literally put in B when I meant A on the bubble sheet. And so making sure that they can go back and double check, and perhaps taking the extra time to double check each answer, right? That alone, just making sure they didn't grid in the wrong thing. And then having strategies to make sure that they're sort of in their head saying problem 11A, and then when they go to the answer sheet, problem 11A, going back and forth and repeating it, just again, because they're just more prone to making those, what we'll call mechanical errors. Using their finger to keep place, using their pencil to keep track of where they are, right? For some students, don't need that finger or that pencil. It actually slows them down. For students with weaker visual spatial skills, makes all the difference in avoiding silly mistakes. Okay, we're going to keep going. We have less than 10 minutes left. The last one is coachability. So this is a student, again, I'm using the sort of extreme example where they have, and I will reiterate that all the examples we're using are profiles that have come through the Mindprint platform in the last week, right? So these are all real students that are struggling with real things, and that the folks on this call or our other clients are working to support students in. I mean, these are, students do have this variability in performance, and we want to support them, help them become self-aware and know how to manage this variability. So again, we've got this great student with strong reasoning skills, strong memory skills, and this weaker flexible thinking, right? And so this is a student where those trick questions, like the 1 or 2 questions that might be the difference between getting their near perfect score on the SAT and ACT versus getting just a really good score, can be stressful for the student. And it's because, they're flexible thinking. They need to know how to handle the unexpected, right? They're capable of handling it, but they need to not panic and react to it in the right way. So how, and again, structured approach for things that don't come easily to you are going to be the most effective. So in this, like, what do you do specifically when you get a question that you don't know exactly how to answer, right? So this is a student who might, 90% of the questions are going to know exactly what to do. What happens for those 10% or maybe even less that they just don't know what to do? What do I do? And in this case, you take a deep breath and relax, right? That's like the first thing, because that's otherwise the test anxiety starts to come in and overtake us, and other things go wrong. Have an approach. Decide, how am I going to decide if I'm going to tackle that really complicated question, or am I going to move on? Does it differ whether I'm on the science section or I'm on the English section? Does it matter how much time I know I have left, or where I am in the test taking process? Am I going to tackle it, or am I going to move on? And how am I going to make that decision? Kids with weaker flexible thinking tend to have a lot of difficulty making the decision of what should I do. That alone can cause their anxiety. And then if you're going to tackle it, what do you do? Okay, so in a lot of cases, it's restating the question in your own words. Student already, we know, has good reasoning skills. Don't get caught up on the language. Restate it in your own words. You're good at reasoning. Let's go through that. And then, now I go to sort of a strategy, maybe like a similarities and differences strategy, right? So what does this look like that I've seen before? I just restated my question. What other question have I seen like that? What did I do when I was on that question? I have a good memory. I should be able to pull that out of my memory. What did I do the last time? Can I do the same thing here? If I can't do the same thing, why can't I? How is this problem different? Does that give me a clue to how to solve the problem? So again, strategies and specificity is going to make a big difference for students in all of these different areas of discrepancy. In most cases, your students will, have a capability, they can do well. How do we really help them live up to their full potential on these tests? So, and that comes to, we'll call it the art of tutoring or teaching, which is, they're capable. How do we give them the right strategies when they're struggling and not living up to what to the score that they want to achieve, right? Whether their parents want them to achieve it, or they want to achieve it, or they feel like they must, given the environment that they're in. And then pick strategies that are, here we've given you the ones we think are going to be in general the best, but you as the tutor are going to have to match which strategies are going to be best for that student based on their Mindprint profile, based on where you've seen them struggling in the past, what you're observing, your own experience about what's going to work for this student, what you see about their interest and motivation, how much you have to do to build their self-confidence, and of course their anxiety and their emotions, and how much anxiety is still playing a role, and what you can do to reduce that anxiety so that we can get the best out of that student. So we showed you earlier that we do have still another nine plus months of learning in 2020. We hope you'll keep coming back. And if you can't join us live, that you will go and visit our YouTube channel and be able to, revisit the webinars and share them with friends so that they can keep learning with us as well. In this case, if you are a tutor, Neil Seltzer has joined us in working with our tutors, so you can reach out to Neil directly. Those of you who know Vicky, she is of course still with us. You've heard her voice on this webinar, and you can always reach out to her as well, or myself. We are here to help and here to help you help your students to succeed. So that is it for today. We finished with 4 minutes to spare. I'll sort of pause again and see if there are any questions that we can answer for folks. And if not, please look for the email where you can access the webinar later. And thank you for coming.